Good morning. I begin today by acknowledging the Gadigal people, traditional custodians of the land on which I am sitting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. 4 years ago, almost to this day, I was involved in a post-COP event very similar to this one, where we were discussing the outcomes of COP23 in Bonn. And I had a slide with what the countries had agreed to relating to carbon markets. And it was blank. Because while they'd had plenty of good debate, they hadn't come to any agreement. The next year, after COP24, I was involved in a similar event. And again, I had my slide with what the parties had agreed to and on carbon markets. And again, it was blank. So here I am now, a few days after COP26, this time with no slides, but a very different message. And it feels surreal to say that after years of negotiations, the countries have now reached agreement on the rule book to govern the international trade of carbon. And that's the focus of this webinar today. My name is Bianca Sylvester. I'm a director at the CEFC, and I'm going to be facilitating the session this morning. I've been working in the climate and clean energy space for 15 years now, and most recently at the CEFC for the last 4 years. It's been a very big 2 weeks, and I think we can all agree that there was more progress made at the COP in some areas versus others. And one area where there was quite some substantial progress was in finalising the rules to govern the trade of carbon internationally. The question is, now that we have the rule book to govern carbon markets, what's next? How will carbon markets evolve? Will they expand? Will they become more diverse? Will we have more confidence and integrity in the quality of the offsets that are being traded? And when is the right time to start engaging in these markets? These are kind of the questions that we'll be focusing on today. I do realise that it's not easy to take what happens at a COP and translate that into a clear picture of how that will affect our day-to-day business activities here in Australia. However, we've got a fantastic panel of local and international speakers that have quite different perspectives on the market. And so hopefully we'll be able to provide some clarity to that picture, whether you are an investor, whether you're a corporate, an intermediary, or even a project developer. As always with these webinars that the CEFC hosts, and we actually host these roughly on a monthly basis, this is our 8th CEFC Green Room, we will keep the format very conversational, so no slides. I will be asking a series of questions to the speakers for the first half, and in the second half, I'll ask you, the audience, to ask your own questions, and you can use the online chat box to do that. But before I pass to the panel, I just would like to spend a few minutes to set the scene. The first point I wanted to make is that I think it's important to remember that while we are focusing on carbon markets in this session this morning, we're not considering them in isolation, and there's no suggestion that they are standalone or a substitute for reducing emissions. They are one tool for reducing residual emissions that cannot be reasonably abated. And I think this is very clearly outlined in the Glasgow Climate Pact, where the reference to the rule book for carbon markets, or Article 6, takes up about 2 lines of the 10-page document. So it's clearly one small component of a much broader effort to address climate change from both a mitigation and adaptation perspective. The second point is that not every country will choose to engage in the international trade of carbon, but many will. And Australia is one of those countries. The Australian government has announced just recently that domestic and international offsets will make up about 10 to 20% of its net zero by 2050 plan. And it's also announced an Indo-Pacific carbon offset fund backed by $104 million. And in Glasgow, they announced that Fiji and PNG will be the inaugural partners of that carbon fund. And this is, of course, in addition to the domestic offset market that it continues to support through the Climate Solutions Fund, where it purchases Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs. And the third point I'd like to make is that not every business will choose to purchase offsets, be they domestic or international, but many will. And we are seeing a tremendous increase in interest in offsets. And that interest has translated into the Australian carbon credit unit price increasing by around 139% year to date. And as well as that demand for the local Australian carbon credit units, we are also seeing significant demand for international offsets. Quite a range of international offsets, but predominantly those that are certified by the Australian government's Climate Active standard. And that includes the voluntary carbon units. And we're lucky to have David Antonioli here today, given that he's the CEO of Verra, that administers the trade of VCUs globally. So that's the context of where carbon markets is situated in the Glasgow Climate Pact, and also what's happening here in Australia, both from a government perspective and a corporate perspective. I'm now going to pass over to the panel, and we're going to focus first on the Australian picture. So I'd like to take the opportunity now to introduce you to Ben Stewart. Ben has over 13 years of experience in environmental and water markets, and he's currently the Chief Commercial Officer at Xpansiv. Xpansiv hosts a global online digital platform for ESG products, including carbon offsets. And for background, I'm pleased to say that the CEFC has recently announced a cornerstone investment into the Xpansiv platform. So, Ben, given that you have visibility of what's being traded in the market, can you start with just providing us with a bit more detail on what's been happening here in Australia? What are the trends and what types of offsets are being purchased in the market?
Thanks, Bianca, and thanks for having us today, and thanks to the CEFC for putting on this event. Look, the Australian market has really seen a rapid increase in trading activity in carbon offsets. Mostly across as Bianca mentioned, the Australian carbon credit units, which are offsets that are produced here in Australia under the Carbon Farming Initiative, regulated by the Clean Energy Regulator here in Australia. So those units, as Bianca mentioned, have seen a rapid increase in price over time, from sort of, the teens, high teens through to now trade just about nudging up to $40 a tonne. So it's kind of, seen a really rapid increase, and that sort of rise in price we've seen across the spectrum of offsets globally, which is really interesting. As Bianca mentioned, under the Climate Active program here in Australia, you've got VCUs produced under the Verra standard. You can trade VERs under the Gold standard, and also CERs from the CDM mechanism that are all valid under that program. Across the board for those products, we've seen reasonably significant increases from sort of trading from less than $1 in some of these products over a year ago to now, through some standardised contracts that we've brought to market, we're seeing the prices for renewable-backed products trading as high as $8, and the nature-based solutions, which mostly focus around forestry and from the Verra standard that David administers, trading above $13 a tonne. So, and that's risen from a price of around $3.80 when we launched the contract in April of this year. So really rapid increases in products. And when we look at those offsets on a global trend against all commodities, carbon has been the best performing commodity globally in the last 12 months. So for those particular products. So it's really interesting to see those increases. And I think one of the things I think we will start to see continuing is that the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, which is where the CERs are produced, I think were via the Glasgow talks have probably been thrown a bit of a lifeline, and I think that we'll start to see some of those products trade probably more regularly and see price increases. But that's also been a product that Australian market participants and the private sector have used quite a lot in order to sort of meet their net zero commitments.
With that as background, I guess, how do you see that now being impacted now that the carbon markets chapter of the Paris Agreement rulebook has been finalised?
Yeah, look, I think what Article 6 has really done is given us a good foundation and a level of understanding of what will be globally recognised and helps us sort of continue to lay the framework and build out the integrity of the market. And I think, that's probably something that David will talk to later as being a key role in that, as the Verra administration has played a significant role over many years. So I think that's been one really key thing, that the private sector and the public sector now have a lot more clarity around what are eligible units and what sort of products will trade. I think it's also gone a long way to sort of figuring out the accounting standards around how this will be recognised against national inventories in the private sector, and sort of helping give some clarity around where those markets will. There's still a little bit of, a few things to hash out, so it's not 100% baked and the clarity is not fully there, but at least we've now got the foundation for the market to build on. And I think that's been really, really key. And the interesting part about it is that, while this is a significant step forward, I think what we have seen in the last 12 to 18 months is that the private sector has really taken a giant leap forward to drive this market independent of any of these processes, which I think has been a huge driver in helping governments come to the table and actually reach agreement, because a lot of domestic, entities in each one of those countries that were probably fence sitters traditionally, including Australia, have now sort of taken a really big stand. And I think, it makes it much easier when a certain amount of your GDP is now under a net zero commitment in its own right voluntarily. So I think that's actually played a huge role in helping us progress the negotiations at COP26, that the global voluntary market has had such a rapid increase in the way it's sort of become more sophisticated, more globally recognised and accepted, and that's been a huge change in the last 12 to 18 months, as I mentioned. And I think we've seen that in the price rise, but also the types of participants that we've seen come to the market. These products are now seen as something where, for the investment community, it's a very legitimate way to get exposure to carbon markets. And I think that's a significant leap forward for the voluntary market. It's always had its core supporters of offsetting companies that offset, the airlines and others that have been sort of very active in this space for a significant amount of time. But now you're seeing it become more of a mainstream acceptable product. And I think that's shown huge benefits to the market. Not namely that increase in price, but that also drives innovation down to the core of where these projects are being developed, and gives a very clear signal to what the return on investment in these projects are, which I think is something we haven't really seen at this scale since the start of these markets.
Yeah, 100%. And do you see that trend continuing, especially now that there is more clarity around the rules? Do you see that mainstreaming of carbon, continuing to escalate and new entrants coming into the market? And when do you expect that to kind of reach a peak or begin to start? Is that sort of now, or do you see that once there are some of the rules that are a little bit shady, not shady, but if they're a little bit hazy, once they're more clear, do you think that will bring in new entrants into the market?
Yeah, look, I think the private sector is really already there, and I think we'll continue to see it grow. But I think there's the amount of momentum we've seen, just speaking from our own experience, in the calendar year 19, we traded 10 million tonnes of carbon on our platform. Calendar year 20, we traded 30 million tonnes of carbon on our platform. And year to date in 21, we're at 110 million. So that sort of gives you a bit of an idea of the scale of the increase. And, I think the market globally has tracked very similar to those sorts of increases. And, there's a lot of predictions around the size of the market. They're very varied and very wide, but always forecasting is a tough thing to do. But, the size of the market is estimated to get into, by 2050 into the trillion. So, in terms of notional value. So that's a significant market. You're sort of getting into the realms of being bigger than oil and gas and things like that. So it's pretty significant, what we're sort of starting to see. And I think that's already begun. And I think that increase in price is only going to bring more innovation, because, the return on investment on some technologies needed that price rise in order for them to make sense and get off the ground. I think, it'll be interesting to see what things come to market, what innovation this drives that allows Verra and other standards to create methodologies to let the carbon market do its thing and continue to be a supporter of innovation and technologies.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. We might now move to look more at an investor perspective. And so I'd like to introduce you to Ian Learmonth. Ian is the CEO of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. He has worked more than 30 years as a financier and an investor, and he's worked in Australia, Hong Kong and Europe across clean energy and major infrastructure projects. As well as doing that, he has pioneered social impact investments in his prior role where he established Social Venture Australia's impact investing business. So Ian, you attended the COP, and I know that one of the key themes you observed around the Australian Pavilion was carbon markets. So can you give us a sense of the Australian presence there and what types of organisations were and what the sort of level of interest in carbon markets was around the Australian Pavilion?
Thanks, Bianca, and a pleasure to be here at a CEFC Green Room. It was an absolute privilege to be at COP26 and get a first-hand look at, really, I guess, the dynamics of what was, a watershed conference, certainly, I guess, the most significant since Paris. And Australia had a pavilion at COP26, which is the first time that we have had a presence like that. So that was very significant in a way. We, of course, only a week or so before had made the announcement of net zero by 2050, which, I guess was, without that, I don't know whether we could have even had a pavilion, but there we were, and there was a government that has made that particular step, which was obviously significant. And the Prime Minister, of course, was at COP26 in the first couple of days at the pavilion, and then Angus Taylor, Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction, was there across the first week. And there were a raft of, of course, plenary speeches and panels that were undertaken by various representatives, including myself. But the interesting thing about the Australian, I guess, broader delegation or the pavilion was that there were a significant number of corporates represented there. Some of them, I think, there off their own bat, others invited by the government. And it was quite an interesting range of companies. And it was everyone from, the big industrial mining players, people like Fortescue, of course, which have Fortescue Future Industries and are pushing green hydrogen in an unimaginably ambitious way. So Andrew Forrest and team there across the 2 weeks. People like Santos, who are now, I guess, transitioning the company, a very significant emitter, transitioning that company to leverage off its existing gas business and moving into things like the use of carbon capture and storage, and therefore blue hydrogen and ultimately green hydrogen. So 2 big corporates, I guess, moving into the hydrogen space. But as well as that, other interesting companies playing in soil carbon, one of the great attributes that Australia has. There were carbon farmers there, companies like Sequest, the MacDoc Foundation, that are already doing quite a lot of carbon farming here in Australia, and financial players like the Macquaries and the HSBCs that are getting into natural capital and looking at creating carbon credits and monetizing those credits across now the global implications of these undertakings, these net zero undertakings, or even ambitious reductions by 2030, of course, means that not just Australia is looking for carbon offsets, but many, many countries, of course, because it's almost impossible to get yourself to absolute zero. And as you mentioned, Bianca, Australia's undertaken in its drive to get to net zero by 2050, that 10 to 20% of that will be met from domestic and international offsets. So offsets, very, very, very big topic at COP, and manifesting itself, I guess, in things like the Emissions Reduction Fund, looking at additional methodologies that will cover a broader range of soil carbon methodologies, looking at rewarding green and blue hydrogen, with credits. And also, down the track, I think methodologies around embodied carbon in building products. And there's a really fascinating company there, MCI, represented by Sophia Hamblin-Wang, who in fact won an international pitch competition against thousands and thousands of other international companies, venture-style companies pitching. So really got a lot of publicity. But that was a building product, effectively an embodied carbon building product like cement or gyprock. So I'm sure a company you'll hear a lot more about. So yes, big themes around hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and embodied carbon around the Australian Pavilion, reflecting, I guess, the big conversations that were happening more broadly across COP26.
Thanks, Ian. And you alluded to this, but we have made CEFC has made a number of really exciting investments into carbon markets world, particularly this year. Are you able to talk to some of those investments in a little bit more detail and those areas where you see as being opportunities for us as an investor in Australia?
Certainly, and so we've made some initial investments that have directly in this space, and we have a whole raft of opportunities in our pipeline, particularly in the soil carbon area. I mean, we've made an initial investment in a company called Loam Bio, which is a soil carbon technology company through our innovation fund, and that's attracted some very high-profile investors, including the founder of Salesforce and Mike Cannon-Brookes. So there's some deep pockets looking to invest in the soil carbon sector. Pleased to say that we've made an investment in one of my fellow panelists' companies, Xpansiv. So CEFC is now a shareholder in Xpansiv, and that obviously was a strategic investment for us. I mean, a digital exchange and multi-product exchange in the ESG markets like Xpansiv is already seeing, as outlined 10 minutes ago, the very, very rapid increase in volumes around CERs and ACCUs and so on. So we've made an investment in, if you like, a platform in the sector. But as I say, we have a whole raft of interesting investments in our pipeline. There are a lot of agricultural players out there making investments in properties, in the pastoral sector, and reconfiguring how they're operating those farms and generating, as well as the yields that they're making out of conventional pastoral farming, but through revegetation, of course, generating ACCUs that are now being sold, through platforms like Xpansiv, or in fact back to the government through the the auction mechanism that the ERF has. We've also helped finance large companies like Orica, who have reconfigured the way that they're making explosives and producing dramatic reductions in carbon through technologies that are being implemented. So we provide, in some cases, concessional debt to allow those business cases to be more easily met, as well as equity investments, as I say, in companies like Loam Bio and Xpansiv. So I see it, Bianca, I see a raft of fantastic investment opportunities coming about through through these global trends and the rapid increase in carbon markets.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, certainly a very exciting space in Australia. We're now going to move to the international picture, which is also very exciting. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to David Antonioli, who is the CEO of Verra and also serves on the board of directors for the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. And he's joining us today from Washington, DC. So Verra, as you know, manages the Voluntary Carbon Standard Program, which is the world's most widely used voluntary carbon program, and the voluntary carbon units, or the VCUs, that trade under that program represent close to, I think it's 70% of transacted volumes in the voluntary market globally. And here also in Australia, VCUs are recognised by the Australian government's Climate Active Standard program. So David, it's been really exciting in the voluntary carbon markets internationally for the last few years. So can you tell us a little bit about what's been happening in the voluntary market from your perspective, particularly in the last few years since the Paris Agreement was signed?
Yeah, well, thank you, Bianca, and thanks again to you for the invitation to be here with all of you, even though it's from Washington, D.C. But pleasure to be here. Well, I think we're very excited just to begin with the passage of Article 6 rules, because ultimately that gives governments another tool to fight climate change, and that's all good. We need everything we can throw at the table. But to your question, what we've seen over the last several years is just this incredible growth in the voluntary carbon markets. In 2020, we had twice the issuances we saw in 2019. In 2021, we're going to likely see doubling of issuances again. And who knows what it's going to look like for 2022. But there's, I'm speaking to several project developers and they're saying, the shelves are empty. I'm out of credits. And so we're starting to see a huge number of projects come through the registration, which is obviously very, very exciting because obviously it means a lot of climate action. But two things to say about that. The first is that for a long time, I think the voluntary market has been growing in part because it's been the only game in town, right? So there's really been nothing else that you can literally turn on a dime and show outcomes, which is one of the great things about the voluntary carbon market. There's a platform, there's infrastructure, there's the VCS program, there's the gold standard, there's the American Carbon Registry, there's the Climate Action Reserve, and you can actually invest today and make projects happen, and soon enough you can start to see credits generated. And that's great, and I think that's been one of the key things that we've found that the voluntary markets are great for and have a lot of potential. And we still continue to see future growth. I'd say that one of the takeaways from COP, in addition to all the excitement about Article 6, et cetera, is that I think that there's a growing realization that on the demand side of things, there really does need to be a lot more work done so that the claims that companies are making off the back of investing in projects are clarified. Right now, there really isn't much guidance as to what it means to be carbon neutral or to compensate your emissions. I think you guys in Australia are way ahead of this, given the Climate Active program. But the rest of the world really hasn't grappled with issues even beyond, do I have a science-based target and am I meeting it? And if I'm meeting it and I'm offsetting my residual emissions, what kind of claim can I make? Which might be different than if I'm just offsetting my emissions, right? And I think that there's a growing realization that we really do need a lot of effort placed on the claim side of it so that we can really make sure that the voluntary market complements internal reductions. Because if we're only offsetting, we're just moving the deck chairs, right? We're not going to solve the problem. So we see a really critical role for voluntary markets to the extent that they can complement those internal reductions which companies ought to be making voluntarily. And I think that, to me, is the secret sauce or the perfect world. And if we can get to that, that would be great. I imagine that in a year's time, we'll be having a very interesting conversation about that, particularly because there's a new initiative called the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, which is going to be diving in and looking at that and hopefully clarifying what the kinds of claims that companies can make. And then on the supply side, you've got, you mentioned the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, which has now become the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, on whose board I serve. And the idea there is to establish a threshold level of performance of carbon credits that are accepted under that rubric, if you will. So that's really the supply side. And I think if we, again, in a year's time, if we've got clarity and guidance from those two initiatives, we'll be able to make sure that the voluntary market is complementing, internal reductions that companies making voluntarily, and also, any upcoming or increasing regulations, coming out of Article 6, or just the increasing commitments. And I think that's a really important piece, because oftentimes people think that we at Verra want to see the voluntary markets grow exponentially forever. And that's not the case at all. I mean, the reality is that it's been the only game in town. It's drawn a lot of investment. And it's been the only game in town because in many ways, companies have felt that there's lack of leadership by governments to tackle the problem. And so they feel like we got to do something. Here's an opportunity. I'm going to do that. And so that's driving the demand. And on the supply side, there really is still not enough regulation of the economies around the world. And that gives rise to the opportunity to invest in projects that otherwise wouldn't have happened. The very first question we ask a project is, are you required by regulation, right? And if it is, then you really can't generate a carbon credit out of it because it's going to happen anyway. So as governments start to, increase the scope and ambition of their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, that might mean that over time there'll be less demand and there'll be less supply, and that's good. That would be a great world. But right now, even those signals from governments are going to take a while to kick in. And I'll come back to my original point that that's where the voluntary market is very exciting. It can actually make stuff happen now until and the time when governments actually, get around to actually regulating these things and putting in place real regulations that'll get us to a 1.5 degree world. I'll stop there.
Thanks, David. Lots of good points in there. I think maybe just something to add, the Paris Agreement rulebook for carbon markets does validate the importance of the voluntary carbon market. So I wonder if you can just talk to that a little bit. And then you've been talking about how the voluntary carbon market has been the only game in town, and that's absolutely right. I'm interested in your thoughts on how you see the voluntary carbon market evolving over time once the markets under the Paris Agreement do sort of start to kick into force.
Yeah. So ideally, I think that there's two scenarios that I want to play out for you. The one scenario is what I described before, right? So governments step up, they regulate, companies feel like, oh, everything's under control, I don't have to do anything more, and there's limited scope for action beyond what governments are regulating, right? And that kind of would portend the end of the voluntary market as we know it today, and that would be great, because again, we'd kind of be on our way, kind of from a regulation, government oversight perspective, to get to 1.5 degrees. There's another scenario, which really relates back to the role that carbon crediting can do in terms of the long-term solution. So if you're familiar with the Science Based Targets Initiative, they're basically saying, companies, you need to be on a trajectory to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions by 90 to 95% of your emissions today. But we recognize that in 2050, or ideally before, you're going to have residual emissions because we're not going to be able to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions altogether across the entire world. So in that case, we're going to need companies to be removing or drawing down, atmospheric carbon from the atmosphere through quote unquote removal. So that's planting trees, that's direct air capture technologies, carbon capture and storage, all those things, right? And so there's a long-term role for carbonauts to be playing in that space to make sure that we have the systems in place to draw down the atmospheric carbon. And I'm going to take it a bit step further, to be the eternal optimist, because if I weren't an optimist, I wouldn't be in this business. And that is to say that, right now we're dealing with the consequences of 1 degree warming. And we've agreed as a society that we're okay with 1.5 degrees. That's still some significant, devastating consequences to populations all around the world. So my sincere hope is that actually we can use the carbon markets to get below 1.5 degree. We can supercharge the removals piece and draw down more atmospheric carbon. We might be able to get beyond 1.5 degrees. And so that's why I don't think that the voluntary markets will disappear altogether, because even if we meet the target set out of 1.5 degrees, there's still plenty to do. And I'm sure that there will be companies saying, I can be part of this ongoing solution that avoids serious catastrophic consequences. Did I answer your question, Bianca?
You did. Thanks, David. It was great.
Stars. yeah, so you can come back to me. I didn't answer the piece about Article 6 and Glasgow, but I'm happy to come back to that. But I'll let you decide.
I might come back to that depending on what questions we get from the audience. So we've talked now about voluntary markets internationally, and we're now going to talk about the Paris Agreement markets internationally under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I'd like to introduce you to Chandra Sinha. So Chandra is the lead financial specialist in the climate change group at the World Bank. Chandra has been at the World Bank since 1997, and he was part of the team that established carbon finance at the World Bank in the early 2000s. This is not part of his official bio, but there's a small handful of people that started the first generation of carbon markets under the Kyoto Protocol, and Chandra was one of those people. So we're very lucky to have him here today. He's now playing a very steady hand in guiding the next generation of carbon markets through the World Bank's Climate Warehouse program and the Climate Market Club that it has established. And Chandra's also worked at JP Morgan and the Harvard Kennedy School. So Chandra, how do you see global carbon markets evolving from here, and how is that different from the way that carbon is currently being traded at the moment?
First of all, thanks, Bianca. Thanks for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here and listen to David, Ben, and Ian as well. The way I see it is basically a continuum from where David left off, that the voluntary markets have played an immense role because of a lack of regulatory certainty that happened after the end of the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. And basically, you put it in terms of the voluntary markets were the only game in town. And they played that role in channeling the urgency of action that is necessary and the urgency that's been communicated by the stakeholders and the shareholders of the private sector enterprise to get corporates moving. And that, I think, is going to lead to, as in an optimistic scenario, as David was indicating, now action by countries to move their mitigation programs and their activities forward, and in that process to be able to utilize the carbon markets in order to manage the cost and increase economic efficiency and move towards international capital transfers in some ways to help the poorer countries engage as actively as possible in the mitigation activity. So what will happen, I think, is that the voluntary market would continue to grow and would move towards more and more activities in developing countries, which would need to take into account how these activities by the corporate sector, by the private sector, influences their NDC. And if you look at the text that was agreed at Glasgow, the whole process of authorizing activities, mitigation activities, and its linkages to the NDC will become clearer and clearer. And therefore, over time, as David was indicating, you would move more towards the compliance markets, where a lot more attention will be paid by developing countries in authorizing activities, which is consistent not just with their mitigation activities, but with their long-term goals. Now, in order to get there, what we would need to do is to build the capacity, the regulatory framework, the institutional capacities in the developing countries through initiatives of the kind that you described, Australia engaging on with the island states in the Pacific, to build capacities and channel investment, which creates the mitigation outcomes or the emission reductions, which then can benefit from a liquid carbon market and drive investment. So there is some initial liquidity that's been created through the transition of the clean development mechanism, which would introduce carbon markets in many more countries than would be the case without it. And I think the movement towards defining regulatory mechanisms or systems in developing countries, the institutional arrangements, would move us towards more towards the compliance market, with pre-compliance markets in many cases emerging from the voluntary activities that we have today.
Thanks, Chandra. And I know that the World Bank is currently running a number of pilot activities to pilot the compliance markets, or in other words, the markets under the Paris Agreement, the non-voluntary markets. Can you talk to us a little bit about those pilots and what you've been learning so far, and what's been working well from your perspective?
Certainly, thanks. You know that the multilateral development banks have been a fairly significant players in providing climate finance that is necessary for the transitions that are necessary to implement climate change. You know, the MDBs provided close to 60 of the $80 billion of climate finance that was identified going into Glasgow. And the World Bank itself has committed to $25 billion of new commitment every year going up till 2025. Now, those investments contribute to the implementation of countries' NDCs and contribute to mitigation activities, which can then be monitored and converted into emission reduction. So that's been the anchor for our piloting effort, looking at 50 to 70 large programs that we prepare and finance every year, and trying to understand how these link to NDCs and how you could create Article 6.2 or Article 6.4 approaches to them. And because the World Bank is a sovereign, lends to sovereign entities, we participate through our client country financial intermediaries like development banks. And let me give you one example of the pilots to give you a sense of what we've been doing. The infrastructure development company in Bangladesh was set up about 15 years ago with the support from the World Bank. And over the last decade, we've provided over $600 million of lending to them to implement clean cook stove programs, solar lighting systems, solar irrigation pumping, and all of these projects, we've helped them quantify the emission reductions, register these projects, and in the initial years, we even went to contracted through the World Bank carbon funds that we operate on behalf of a number of buyers. And now we are moving towards getting them to access the market, for instance, through doing a carbon-linked bond, which would support their solar irrigation programs. So the idea is to provide resources which are consistent with their development priorities, at the same time ensure appropriate monitoring of the mitigation activities that take place to generate the emission reduction using methodologies from the CDM, from Verra, from Gold Standard, in order to facilitate greater level of investment activity along those lines. So there are, as I said, 50 to 70 new operations every year that we do in renewable energy, energy efficiency, methane abatement, agriculture, climate smart agriculture. We hope to get into the area that Ian talked about, soil organic carbon. So there's a whole range of those activities.
Thanks, Chandra. Clearly, so much innovation and so much happening at the moment. So it's great to get a sense of that from you. We are now going to move to the broader Q&A part of the session. So thanks to everyone that has already submitted all of your questions. There's a number to get through. So the first one that I've got for the panel is, the question is, are there any risks of carbon trading? And specifically, could companies could this be seen as a cop-out to transitioning? So feel free to comment on that and maybe add as well any other sort of headline risks that you see from your perspective.
I'll jump in. Yeah.
David? Oh, everyone wants to jump in.
Just from a market side, David will be able to speak to the integrity side much deeper than I can. But from the market side, I think this was an issue in years gone by when the products were trading at very low prices and there wasn't a big investment to do offsetting. Since we've seen the last 12 to 18 months, the increase in pricing going up sort of 700% in some cases, these are meaningful dollars that people are putting to work, and it actually puts a real price on carbon internally. and it helps drive the mitigation because they actually have an understanding of what the cost of that carbon is. So that commitment, that ongoing commitment to do that seems to be going one direction at the moment, is getting more expensive. So it actually drives better behaviours from what we've seen because, it's not a cheap exercise anymore, and it takes real commitment from companies. So, and the integrity of the products, again, David can talk to, has gone up, significantly. And I think a lot of more understanding of the carbon offsets and how they're generated through communities and the private sector has been a great increase in that knowledge base. But I'll leave it there for David.
I'm happy to pipe in here. I think that's a great point that Ben is making, that, with the prices today, it's starting to hurt, right? And that's a good thing. But I think the other part to this, and I mentioned this when I spoke earlier, is that there really are there's very little clarity in respect to the kinds of claims companies can make on the back of investing in projects. So I think as we start to unpack and clarify those claims, I think people will start to understand what claims companies really are making when they're investing in credits. And I think for the companies that are, again, have a target, are meeting that target, and are investing in projects, that's great. And they will shine. And the companies who are just buying offsets, well, people might say, well, I'm not so convinced, right? So I think there'll be a move to push companies to take targets, meet them, and then reduce their emissions. And if we get there, I think the risks of that greenwashing concern will be much diminished. Now, we're not there yet, and I think that's still an issue. But I think for companies, that's something to really consider. There will be guidance about this. And so it's a great opportunity to position yourself to be among the leaders in that space.
Thanks for that. And I think I would just add what we are seeing is that those organisations that are buying offsets are doing that as part of a broader, quite sophisticated corporate sustainability strategy. We're not seeing companies doing it necessarily on a standalone basis. And what we're seeing is it's quite to the contrary, that it's not the laggards that are buying carbon offsets. It's the leaders in the market that have strong, sophisticated corporate sustainability strategies, of which offsetting is just one small component. We've received another question that's quite topical to Australia. So I'm interested in Ian and Ben's views, but also interested from an international perspective on this, about carbon capture and storage. So the Australian government has announced that they are developing or have developed a method for carbon capture and storage to generate Australian carbon credit units under the Climate Solutions Fund. So just wondering, just keen for your views on other countries that might be looking at creating credits for carbon capture and storage, and to what extent, how that is perceived in the market at the moment.
Bianca, we're happy to say a few things, maybe firstly just about the Australian status and situation, and then no doubt hear from our international colleagues on other thoughts around CCS, and no doubt there's the American examples of enhanced oil recovery, which I know is something that's often the subject of much debate. But yes, in Australian terms, I think as you flag, the government are they're very positive and encouraging of carbon capture and storage. It's one of the Morrison government's priority technologies. The government put out here in Australia from time to time their what's called the low emission technology statement, and the most recent one continues to have carbon capture and storage as one of the key 5 or 6 technologies that this government's focused on. And I think it's interesting. Australia obviously has in some cases some extraordinary attributes to undertake CCS, particularly, I guess, the big gas companies. And I mentioned Santos, and they were very, had quite a profile there at COP26 with their project at the Beetaloo Basin, which the government have already announced support for, where they would access the empty reservoirs from, the gas extraction that they've been undertaking since the 50s on that side. So there's something like 1,000. There's something like a billion tons of potential sequestration possibility there on that site. So I think that's probably, for the big gas players, and I suspect that's much of the focus that around carbon capture and storage in the Australian context. In the near term, they will need some government support, be that through ACCUs under the Climate Solutions Fund, or maybe direct grant support, before I think they would take that business step. But the good thing is, when I talk to those companies, they see the use of CCS as a sort of a transitional tool to then, particularly in the creation of things like blue hydrogen and getting to green hydrogen ultimately, because it's obviously better if you can create hydrogen through renewable energy than through fossil fuel, a fossil fuel process, and then bury the carbon underground. So I think you'll see some big projects potentially through the large gas companies in Australia. But I'd be interested to hear the international context from my fellow panel members.
Chandra, David, is this something that you're seeing anywhere else in the world?
I mean, we see a lot of interest in CCS, and we're actually we're part of an initiative called the CCS Plus initiative that is looking at this very issue of how you do develop accounting methodologies for CCS. And one of the things we're doing, and you'll see public comment on this early next year, I don't know exactly, but we are working on a tool to look at non-permanence risk, right? So we have a tool right now that addresses non-permanence risk for agriculture and forestry and other land use activities. And those are generally, there's risk related to the reversals from those activities, being that you cut down the forest, it catches fire, which is a climate risk, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a tool designed to address the risks that land-based projects face. But as you can imagine, the risks of reversal for geologic sequestration are rather different. So we're developing a tool that will help kind of stand behind any reductions achieved through carbon capture and storage. And so there is a proper methodology development process going along with that. So we do see a lot of interest. We think it's a great opportunity. And so, we're definitely working on it.
And Bianca, if I could just add, in the long term, to meet the 1.5 degree temperature target, or to go beyond, as David was indicating, there is no choice but to look at removals. And there is a limitation on how much removals are possible through nature-based solutions, and the trade-offs of those nature-based solutions with requirements in the food systems, requirements for competing land uses, and therefore the technology-based carbon capture and storage, I think, is going to gain a tremendous amount of interest, and is the backstop technology, according to many people. And in many of the modeling scenarios, we see very little option but to use these to achieve the overall temperature objectives that we're looking at. So from a longer perspective, I see a huge amount of investment being required for them in order to address the kind of challenges, I think, permanence and leakage kind of issues that are there for any removal option. But quite frankly, according to most people, given where we are today and where we need to be, there is no choice but to engage in carbon capture and storage. The issue is going to be, how do we drive the technology, and what role do markets play, because the costs are very high. And if the prices go up to $50+, you will begin to see, of offsets, begin to go to $50+, you will begin to see very new, dramatically new investments coming, not just on the mitigation side, but also on the removal side.
Thanks, Chandra. Another question, and we've had lots of questions about what's happening internationally. So another question that we have about what's happening internationally is, who do you see as leading the way? So who are the top 3 countries that are leading the way in terms of developing carbon markets for trade internationally?
Maybe I can start, and then based on the long experience we have in the market, it's always driven by the Latin American countries. That's where dramatic activity takes place. This time, for a big change, we are beginning to see interest by a number of African countries as well. And Senegal, Ghana, Rwanda immediately spring to mind, in addition to the usual suspects of Chile, Colombia, Peru, in the case of Latin America. Usually what you see is that the Asian countries are so slower to start with, but that's where the volumes are. So I would expect a lot of, in fact, just after this webinar, there's another discussion with the Indonesian government, Bianca, on their carbon market system. They not just put in a carbon tax, but now have put in an ETS, and now are taking through a legislation on a domestic carbon market. So Indonesia very clearly in the region would be the big player. I think Singapore is doing a lot. So just to name a few of the countries which are very, very actively looking at engagement in the new emerging market.
David, you're also seeing similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all great examples. I would just want to point out 2 things, which I think 2 policies which we find have been really transformational in countries, and that's Colombia and South Africa. And they both have carbon taxes where you can use carbon credits you can surrender carbon credits instead of paying the carbon tax. And in both of those countries, they recognize VCUs issued under the BCS program, gold standard credits, and Clean Development Mechanism, or CERs. And that policy is very simple, but incredibly powerful. And so what it's done, at least in Colombia, it may be too early to tell how it's playing out in South Africa, is that it's helping really drive a lot of finance to far-off places that have not been able to secure resources from the government, especially given the civil war and the fighting that's been taking place, close to the jungles, right? So this has been an incredibly useful and powerful policy instrument that helps projects actually get off the ground, receive long-term finance for doing stuff that, the governments really should be doing, right? Which is not only just protecting the forest, but what many of these projects do is they're really development projects. So they're helping people develop more efficient agricultural practices to reduce pressure on the forest. They're hiring forest rangers to make sure there's no illegal timber or gold mining. They're building schools, they're building health clinics, providing clean water. It's really spectacular what these kinds of projects are doing, and really in many ways doing what government was designed to do, but has been unable to do given lack of resources, the Civil War, the FARC, and all that stuff. So it's just been very transformational. And I think that our understanding is that a lot of countries are going to be looking to these models to see how it plays out. And just one more thing that I think that what's really interesting in Colombia and South Africa is that the potential demand is much higher than the actual supply. And so there really is an excellent opportunity to be thinking about using these mechanisms, or even the voluntary market at large, to drive finance to specific sectors that are needed. And so one of the pieces of work that we did in the run-up to, or we didn't do it, but we helped underwrite it, was the Voluntary Carbon Market Global Dialogue. And it was really an effort to bring to the table and to the discussions about the voluntary carbon market the role and the perspectives of people from developing countries, which is, quite frankly, a perspective which had been sorely missing in many of the debates. And that dialogue kind of came up with some really powerful insights. One is, there's an opportunity to work closely with governments to channel the finance where it's needed. And that's very exciting because governments have until now looked at the voluntary market somewhat skeptically because it operates without their authorization, right? So there's an opportunity here to bring these together and collaborate closely with governments to identify sectors that they may not be able to finance or get going in the short term, and kind of bring them up to speed with the finance that's available, whether it's through the voluntary carbon market or mechanisms like they have in South Africa and Colombia. The other thing is that this dialogue has really put in place or put a focus on the opportunities for developing sectoral approaches. It starts with RED, reduced emissions from avoided deforestation, which we all know can be linked to government actions. But I think there's an opportunity now to be looking at sectors, like hard to abate sectors like cement and steel and petrochemicals, and potentially establish performance benchmarks that apply to those sectors, have downward trajectories, but enable those companies to actually access the finance that's available through the voluntary carbon market or these carbon tax mechanisms to decarbonize. So I think that's just very exciting. And I just wanted to point out those two countries, which I think could lead to a lot of interesting possibilities going forward.
Thanks, David. I think that's a fantastic note to end on. It's very clear that there's a huge amount of evolution that has already taken place in the carbon markets, and that I think the clarity now that the Paris Agreement rulebook provides will only bolster that. And Ben, at the start of the presentation, quoted some numbers for the carbon market in the trillions by 2050. So it's a very exciting space, and I really would love to thank the panelists for their time this morning. Chandra, David, Ben, Ian, thank you again for joining and providing us with such insightful thoughts this morning.
Thank you, Bianca, and thanks, everybody. Great to be on the panel with you all, and good luck. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.